doing today is very much now down to Norman, because Norman suggested that to start the season for 2023, I should review for you the essence of cardiac development. So as we get into the presentation, I will explain to you what is going to happen, but today is going to be an introduction to cardiac development. At the end of today's session, we'll have discussion between Norman, Diane, Adrian, and myself, but we hope, obviously, that if any of you are interested to ask questions or to make comments, that you will join in. Grace cannot be with us today. She has another commitment, but Sasha is in charge. I'm sure, as usual, everything is going to work perfectly. So today's presentation will last for about 3/4 of an hour, so we have plenty of time for discussion. So, welcome to cardiac development, specifically today's introduction to cardiac development. Sasha, let's get on the road. Well, good afternoon to you all, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the 2023 sessions of Cardiac Morphology for the Congenital Heart Academy. You'll immediately see that we're going to start our sessions with discussions of cardiac development. You'll also be aware that throughout last season's sessions, we discussed cardiac development. But it's been suggested to me that this is important. It is not easy to understand, and therefore I should review again for you in a series of presentations the essence of cardiac development. So that's what we're going to try to do in the first 4 months of 2023. Now you see, I ask you all a question: what's new? You can read what is on the screen at the moment, and I hope you all agree with this, that knowledge of cardiac development is important if we are to try to understand the congenital malformations with which we are all confronted. And in fact, it's not particularly new at all. Some of you may have seen this statement before, and it comes from the mother of congenital heart disease seen in the pathology department, Maud Abbott. And she published this in her own atlas of 1936. Now, some of you may also know that I've not always been enthusiastic about cardiac development. And in the mid-1980s, along with Anton Becker, with whom I worked very closely, he and I wrote a somewhat provocative review in which we suggested that knowledge of cardiac development at that time, this is over 40 years ago now, at that time, we expressed the view that such knowledge was potentially a hindrance rather than a help. And this was because at the time, most of the interpretations came from the armchair. They were speculative. Since then, I've had to eat my words. And what we're going to show you now is that it can be a positive advantage. Why is that? Because now we have direct evidence from workbench. And that's what I'm going to be bringing you in these presentations. But in the time that's passed, we've also come to appreciate that many of those speculations were in fact wrong. And at the time when we made our provocative statements, it was thought that all of the components in the divinative heart tube were included in what we call the linear heart tube. And it was thought that ongoing development was simply looping of that tube and then septation. It was somewhat difficult to understand. This is what was suggested. Here we have a linear heart tube. The pictures like this still appear in some accounts of cardiac development. And so what it's being suggested is within the tube, you see you have part that's going to go on the left ventricle, part the right ventricle, and then part which will become the outflow tract, leading to what you see as the aortic sac. And at the venous pole, we have the right and left atrium. Well, in fact, we know that was very much because we now know that the heart is not developed by bending and subsequent septation. Instead, we know that there is an initial heart tube. We know that that comes from what we now call Outfield, bushing of new material, heart forming fields, and both new material comes from what we now call second Outfield. To you. But what is important is to appreciate that we need to change our approach to the understanding development. So the material I'm going to share with you over today and then the subsequent 3 sessions is very much a collaborative effort. I've been very fortunate to work with very dedicated and very knowledgeable embryologists in their own right. For a long time, I worked with Nigel Brown at St George's Hospital here in London. Nigel, like myself, is now retired. I'm going to share with you some of the wonderful dissections he made to show what happens during development. I still work with Deborah Henderson and Bill Chowdhury at Newcastle University. And again, I'm going to share with you some of the material that we are still working on together. But much of the material I'll be sharing with you today comes from the collaborations I established over a period of 20 years or more with Antoon Moorman. Antoon was the chief of chief of anatomy and development at Amsterdam University. Antoon is now retired, but towards the tail end of the period he was at Amsterdam, Alexander Cesarov came and worked with him. I was fortunate to be included in this collaboration, and Alexander is now a pediatric cardiologist in his own right. But I also work very closely now, as you are all aware, with Wout Lammers and with Jill Hickspoors. In fact, Wout also started in the University of Amsterdam. And when we talk about the development of ventricles, I'll be sharing with work that I did with Wout way back in the 1990s. But now he's in Maastricht, and much of the work I'm going to share depends on the wonderful interactive PD files. Those of you who saw us last year will know makes it much easier for us to understand what is going on as the heart develops. But I particularly want to mention the work done by Tim Mohan, because it was Tim Mohan who invented episcopic microscopy. And again, those of you who followed me last year will know I depend very much on the episcopic data sets that Tim prepared whilst he was working, first of all, at Mill Hill in London, and then he moved down to the Crick Institute. But Tim now is also retired, but we have the wonderful data sets to work with that he created. So I depend upon all the work that my colleagues have done to share that with you as we discuss cardiac development. You can see now for yourself much of this material. So this is the reference you need to find the interactive PD files that were prepared by Jill and Wout. And if you go to this publication, Communications in Biology, you will find all of those interactive PD files available, and you can manipulate those in exactly the way that you're going to see me sharing with you images to show what happens during cardiac development. And I would particularly recommend to you this website. This is the Human Developmental Biology resource. As you see at the top there, it's housed at Newcastle University. Deborah Henderson, in fact, now is in charge of this website. And the material you have in this website, to my mind, is truly spectacular. You You see there that you can see 3D models of the developing heart. What is particularly important is the access it gives you to histologic sections. And if you understand echocardiography, I do believe you can understand the histology, and you can check up the material that I'm going to be sharing with you, much of which comes from the hearts that have been prepared, made available within the website of the Human Developmental Biology resource. So let's get going, and let's today make the introduction to cardiac development. I hope that what I show you today is going to set the scene for what we will then discuss over the next 3 sessions. So in February, I'm going to discuss with you the development and septation of the atrial chambers. In March, we're going to move on and we're going to look what happens as the ventricles develop. And then in May, we're going to look at the development of the ventricular outflow tracts. In fact, I got that quite wrong. February is atrial chambers, March is ventricles, and April will be the formation of the ventricular outflow tracts. And that will be our introduction, cardiac morphology for the Congenital Heart Academy. I need to say a few words to you about timing. When we think about development of the human heart, the key period is from the end of the 4th week, 26 days, through 8 weeks of gestation. And at the 8th week of gestation, we move from the embryonic period into fetal period. The changes that occur during this period of around 4 weeks, we describe in terms of Carnegie stages. And this is because these stages were developed by people working in the Carnegie Institute. And they graded these changes during these key stages of development, and they passed through stage 9, 26 days, to stage 23, which is the end of the embryonic period. And so you see, we have 12 stages, we have 4 weeks whilst this takes place. So more or less, it's 2 to 3 days per stage as a rule of thumb. Remember, however, that there are further changes that take place during fetal life. So, but by the end of the Carnegie series, we are at the stage where we have a 4-chambered heart. I'm also going to show you some pictures of mouse hearts, and the key stages here are 8.5 through 14.5 days of gestation. Here it's much easier. We simply talk about the embryonic days, but there is a key difference because birth in the murine embryo occurs no more than 5 days after the end of those key stages for development of the heart. So the much more takes place during fetal life in the human than it does in the mouse. So let's get on and let's look at how we form the primary heart tube. I'm going to start off by showing you these material prepared by Nigel Brown. So these are cultured mouse embryos. The embryo is lying on its back. Those are the head folds. That is the opening to the gut. And Nigel has cultured this transparent mouse embryo so that you can see the myocardium. And the myocardium is shown in blue. It's stained using myosin light chain. And what you see here is the cardiac crescent. And we know that the cells come from this cardiac crescent and they come into the middle part where you see the neck part of the developing embryo, and there they are going to form the primary heart tube. And we have 2 primordiums. Here we are just a little bit later on day 8.5. You're looking at the mouse embryo the same way, the embryo lying on its back, you're looking into the neck. And there you see that the 2 primordiums are coming together and they're going to form the primary heart tube. You'll also note that the myocardium is staining in the venous tributaries. And this is the material that is coming into the heart all the time from the heart-forming areas. We can, in fact, make comparisons with what's going on in the human heart. And these are some of the reconstructions that were made by Anton Moorman together with Alexander Caesarov. It's comparable to what I showed you just a moment ago. You can see the opening of the gut, and this is the pericardium. And the reconstruction has stripped away the pericardium. And so there you see the two cardiac primordiums. And what you also see, this is Carnegie stage 9. We're at the beginning of development, just at the end of the 4th week. And coming out of the top of the pericardium, we have the ventral aortas. Now, if we go on a little bit further, in the mouse heart, we're now towards the end of embryonic day 8.5. Those primordiums have come together, and now we have the primary heart tube. But here is the key. This is the material that has come from first Outfield. It is going to form little more than the left ventricle. And we can see that rather well in one of the beautiful showing this by scanning electron microscopy. Still, the heart the embryo is lying on its back. You're looking into the neck area. The pericardium has been stripped away. And there you see the larger part of the primary heart tube, the first heart field, and that is going to become the left ventricle. But now we see material is being added at the venous pole. It's also being added at the arterial pole. And again, we can make comparisons with developing human heart. This is another reconstructions made by Anton Moorman, Alexander Caesarov, and it's prepared in the same way, but this time with a reconstruction, pericardium stripped away. And there you see the larger part of the primary heart tube. It will form no more than left ventricle. But we have growth at the venous pole. We have growth at the arterial pole. Here we are, Carnegie stage 10. We're at the end of the 4th week of development. But now I've moved on and I'm showing you one of those interactive PD files made by Wout and Jill. And the beauty of these interactive PD files is that you can strip away what's on the outside of the heart and you can look into the cavities. And this is what I've done here. And you see that Jill and Wout have segmented the umbilical veins. This is the blood coming back from the center. These are the vitelline veins. They are lining the yolk sac. And you can see very nicely how they are coming together and forming those venous tributaries. And at this early stage, we have bilateral symmetry. So the venous tributaries come together and they form the area that was forming that primary heart tube from the first heart field, the putative left ventricle. But now we've already had new material added at the arterial pole, and that is forming what will become the outflow tract. And coming out of the outflow tract, we have those ventral aortas. So here we are, we're moving on from a straight heart tube with the addition, new material from the second heart field. And that material keeps on coming in, and that is what stimulates key stage of development, formation of the ventricular loop. And it really does loop. This is another of Nigel's exquisite scanning electron micrographs. You see that more material has entered at the venous pole, and now we can recognize an H component of the primary heart tube. It is still a solitary heart tube now, but now the ventricular part has looped, and from the outlet of the loop, we're going to get development of the left ventricle, right ventricle rather, not quite this stage, but the loop is continuing as the outflow tract. So this is what it looks like in the mouse. We're now at embryonic day 9.5, and you see it's directly comparable in the human. We've moved on a stage here with maybe stage 11. We're now at the beginning of the fifth week of development. We still have the symmetry of the venous inflows to the heart, but the umbilical vitelline veins are coming together. They're forming hepatocardiac channels. Now, however, we also have formation of venous channels in the embryo, the cardinal veins. And they now come together and form what we can call the sinus horns. And they are symmetrical. And within the pericardium now, they have become the atrial part of the primary heart tube. But the ventricular part, continuing beyond the atrioventricular canal, has now looped. And from the end of the ventricular loop, we have the outflow tract continuing again as the ventral aortas. So here we are at the end of the stage where we have a primary heart tube. At this stage, we still have a solitary tube, and it's made of what we're going to call primary myocardium. I'll come back to this in just a moment. But we know now that it is expansion from the cavity of the primary tube that forms the primordiums of what will become the cardiac chambers. And the process of formation of the chambers was emphasized by Anton Moorman along with Vincent Christophels, and they produced this concept of ballooning. And from the atrial component of the primary heart tube, we have ballooning appendages. From the ventricular loop, we have ballooning of the apical ventricular components, and they are going to form what we're going to call chamber myocardium. And this is important because, as you know, when we get to sequential segmental analysis, we need to know how we distinguish the chambers. And this is why it is also important we distinguish between primary myocardium and chamber myocardium. So this is what it looks like when we dissect into the cavities of the interactive PD files from Jill and Wout. You can see that from the inlet part of the ventricular loop, we're beginning to get the apical component of the left ventricle. And from the outlet part, we're beginning to get the right ventricle. The loop continues at the outflow tract. At the margins of the pericardial cavity, it forms the aortic sac. And now, coming out of the aortic sac, we have the arch arteries. And I'm going to come back to that at the very end of today's presentation. But what I'd also like to draw your attention to now is the fact that we also have ballooning from the apical component. And that balloons on both the right and the left sides, and that is going to give us the atrial appendages. And so if we take on one further stage, 2 or 3 days later, we can see very nicely now what is going to give us our definitive heart. Because there is the ballooning of the right appendage, there is the ballooning of the left appendage. But as yet, there's another key feature. As the atrioventricular canal at this early stage is connecting only to the developing left ventricle. But there, from the outlet component of the loop, you see the apical part of the right ventricle, which is supporting the outflow tract. Now, this is what it looks like in a reconstruction made by Jill and Wout. I can now show you some of the episcopic data sets prepared by Tim Bowen. So here I'm concentrating on the atrial component of that heart tube. There is the initial part of the primary heart tube, which will persist as the body. But there, coming in, top of the body, we have systemic venous sinus, ballooning from the right side, right atrial appendage, ballooning from the left side, we have the left atrial appendage. And already, look at the difference between the two appendages. The left appendage already has a narrow neck. The right appendage has a very broad junction with the body of the right atrium. But we can also see the remnants of the primary tube itself. We can see the atrioventricular canal. That's leading into the left ventricle, which is ballooning from the inlet part of the ventricular loop. And here I've cut across the outflow tract. The outflow tract is still primary myocardium. And we can see that If I change the cutting plane and we look at a different embryo, and now we see the ventricular loop. Here you're looking at the undersurface of the atrioventricular canal, and you see very nicely now how that is looking only into the apical part of what will become the left ventricle. Now, when we get to discuss formation of ventricles, we're going to be very interested in what happens to this area between the developing ventricles. And at this stage, we can call this the primary interventricular foramen, because all the blood coming to the left ventricle has to pass through this foramen so as to reach the developing right ventricle, which is supporting the entirety of the outflow tract. And again, you can see very nicely how that outflow tract is still primary myocardium of that heart tube. So I've now been talking for quite some time on primary and chamber myocardium. Do they differ one from the other? And they do. And again, this was emphasized by Anton Mormann. So this is a long axis section, the heart tube of developing mouse heart, and Anton has stained this section for atrial natriuretic factor, and that's shown in blue. And so you see the ventricular trabeculations are positive, the atrial appendage is positive, but the primary heart tube itself is negative. Now, Anton then took an adjacent section to this one, and he stained for connexin 40. This is one of the proteins that links together developing cardiomyocytes and permits them to conduct one to the other. And when we look at connexin 40, again, we see trabeculations are positive, the atrial appendage is positive, but now the primary heart tube stays negative, but an additional area of myocardium has stayed positive. And this is what we call mediastinal myocardium. And that is going to be key for understanding the development of the pulmonary vein. So we can distinguish between the ventricular walls. We know that the chamber myocardium is positive, both atrial natriuretic factor and connexin 40. We know that the primary heart tube, primary myocardium, is negative, both those markers, but then we have the additional area. It's going to be very important, as I say. Think of development of pulmonary veins, negative for atrial natriuretic factor, but positive for connexin 40. So these features will become very important as we move on to consider atrial development. But for the moment, let's return and let's look again at now the sequence of ballooning. And I'm going to show you this with another of the beautiful cartoons made by Anton Mormann quite some time ago. You're looking at the arc from the front, subsequent to looping and subsequent to the beginning of ballooning. And what Anton is showing us here in blue, we see the ballooning atrial appendages, and they are ballooning in parallel from the atrial component of the primary heart tube. But look what's happening in the ventricular loop, because the apical parts of the ventricles balloon in series. The apical part of the left ventricle is ballooning from the inlet of the ventricular loop, the apical part of the right ventricle ballooning from the outlet. So let me emphasize that. The atrial appendage balloon in parallel. The apical parts of the ventricles balloon in series. And this is very important because this tells us why it is only the atrial appendages that show the morphological features of isomerism. So I hope you all now know that chambers become right as opposed to left under the influence of what we call the laterality genes. And we know that it is PITX2, part of the sighted sequence, that is one of the genes that produces morphological leftness. And we also know that there are a series of genes that during development stop these left-forming genes from crossing the midline. Included in those series are lefty one, nodal, another one is sonic hedgehog, and they create a midline barrier so that the leftward genes only influence the left side of the developing embryo. So let's go back to our primary heart tube, Nigel's dissection showing you this early stage. And if we draw a line down the primary heart tube, we know PITX2 will turn this left side into morphological leftness. But we know that if all goes well and development is proceeding normally, those genes creating the midline barrier will stop PITX2 reaching right side. And because there is no PITX2 present, the right side will become morphologically right. But what happens after looping? Because now, having looped, that line separating the right and left sides of the developing heart has itself moved. But now let's look at the atrial component. The atrial component has a right side that now will respond to become morphologically right and will be discrete from the left side, which will work under the influence of PITX2. So when the atrial appendages balloon, the appendage ballooning from the left side will be under the influence of PITX2, so will become morphologically left. The appendage ballooning from the right side will have had the midline barrier stopping PITX2 getting across, and so it will become morphologically right. But what happens in the ventricles? This is going to become the left ventricle. It's that part of the primary heart tube derived from the first heart field, and it has right and left sides, just as does the part developed from the second heart field. So the laterality genes will have comparable effects on the right and left ventricles, and that is why we have isomerism of the atrial appendages. We never have ventricular isomerism. And we can see the influences of this when we knock out some of these genes. So if we knock out the gene for morphologically leftness, everything will become morphologically right. And this is another of Nigel Brown's scanning electron micrographs, a mouse in which the PITX2 gene has been knocked out. And I hope you agree, looking at the underside of these appendages, you see that both of them are morphologically right. We have isomerism of the morphologically right atrial appendages. But this is a mouse in which Professor Ueno from Japan has knocked out FT1. So this now lets PITX2 get across to both sides of the developing heart. And lo and behold, both of the atrial appendages have become morphologically left. We have isomerism of the morphologically left atrial appendages. Isomerism is a real thing, but now you see why it only influences the atrial appendages, and that is why it is the atrial appendages on which we need to focus when we are distinguishing right from left isomerism. So that's all going on inside the heart. I'd like to finish today with just a few words on what is happening outside the heart, because there are important changes also taking place in the remainder of the embryo, and I want to concentrate on the pharyngeal arches, because it is the changes taking place in the pharyngeal arches, also in the venous components, that set the scene for what we're going to be discussing eventually when we talk about atrial development, and also when we talk about development of the outflow tract. So here I've reverted to another of Jill and Wout's interactive PD files. Here I'm showing you the right side of the developing heart enclosed in its pericardial cavity at Carnegie stage 12. We're just in the beginning of the 5th week development. And Jill and Wout have reconstructed the vitelline veins, the umbilical veins. Remember, they come together from the hepatocardiac channels, the cardinal veins, and they are all coming together to form the sinus horns. And what we will discuss next week is how we start off with symmetry of the Venus pole, and it's as we lose that symmetry that we get definitive atrial development, so that the right side becomes morphologically right and the left side acquires the pulmonary vein and becomes morphologically left. So that is what we will be discussing in the next session in February. But let me finish off by looking at the arterial pole. So this is that same embryo, Carnegie stage 12, 30 days of development, and you're looking into the developing neck. And there you see that there are pouches growing out from the gut. And it is these pouches that distinguish the pharyngeal arches. And the arches are cranial to the pouch. So there, between the first pharyngeal pouch and the cavity of the mouth, we have the first pharyngeal arch. But equally important, running through the first pharyngeal arch, we have the first arch artery. And you see there, it's taking origin from the aortic sac. And it is, of course, bilaterally symmetrical. I am showing you here the right side. But you see that there is also a second pouch. And now, between the first and the second pouch, we have the second pharyngeal arch. And running through the second pharyngeal arch, we have the second arch artery. But things happen remarkably fast with the formation of the pharyngeal arches. Here we are, Carnegie stage 12, 30 days of development. I move on just one stage. No more than 2 days have passed. What I showed you a moment ago, and here, Carnegie stage 13. There we still see the first pharyngeal pouch, but now when we look in the first pharyngeal arch, the artery has disappeared. There is the second pharyngeal pouch, so there we have the second arch. And in fact, the second arch artery has become larger. But other things have happened. We have had formation of a third pharyngeal pouch. That means we now have a third arch. And running through the third arch, we have the third arch artery. But additionally, another artery has appeared. And this is going to populate the fourth pharyngeal arch, but as yet, we don't see a fourth pharyngeal pouch. But we move on to just one stage further. Another 2 days have passed. Here we are at Carnegie stage 14. And now we are virtually at the stage where we can see all of the vessels that are going to form the definitive circulation. But look what's happened in the cranial pouches. Here is our first pharyngeal pouch. We'd already lost the artery, first pouch. There's been expansion of the second pouch, and indeed the second arch has grown significantly, but in so doing, it has lost its arteries. So the arteries that will form the definitive pathways are now seen in the caudal arches. So there is the third pouch, third arch artery, and now we've had formation of the fourth pharyngeal pouch, giving us fourth arch, and they're running in the fourth arch, we have the fourth arch artery. But now we have another artery, and I'm going to call this one the pulmonary arch artery. Why am I calling this the pulmonary arch artery? Because we do not get any more formation of pharyngeal pouches. There are only 4 pouches formed during normal development. So, moreover, when we look at the arteries percolating those arches, there are never more than 3 arch arteries present at the same time. Now, if you read traditional accounts, you know that much is based on the so-called Rathke diagram, and that suggests there are 6 arches, one of which is vestigial. And this is not true. There is nothing that lets us think of 6 arches. And so in reality, what we call the artery of the sixth arch, we now need to start thinking of as the pulmonary arch. Why? If there are only 5 pharyngeal arches, then logically that pulmonary arch artery should be called the fifth arch artery. But any of you who know anything about congenital cardiac malformations will know that there is a wealth of literature alleging so-called persistence of the arteries of the enigmatic fifth arch. So if I called the pulmonary arch artery fifth arch artery, I would produce nothing but confusion. In fact, there is no vestigial fifth arch. There are only 4 arches in all, along with that pulmonary arch, and lesions that thus far have been interpreted on the basis of the persistence of those arteries of the alleged fifth arch are much better explained on the basis of either persistence of collateral channels or else remodeling of the aortic sac. So today, I hope I've introduced you to the basis of cardiac development. We are setting the scene for what we are going to be discussing in February, in March, in April. I hope I've shown you enough to show you that the segmental model of development is totally redundant. The key to understanding development is to appreciate throughout these stages, these initial stages, in the 5th, the end of the 4th, the 5th week of development, new material is being added to the heart at both its arterial venous poles from heart-forming areas, and that will continue as we develop the outflow tract. I hope I've shown you the importance of chamber myocardium, and that you now appreciate that the chambers grow by so-called ballooning from the cavity of that primary artery. And finally, I hope I've shown you enough to convince you that there are only 5 pharyngeal arches. There is no vestigial 5th or 6th arch system. And so that final arch we need to think of as the pulmonary arch, because it is the arteries running in that area that give rise to the right and left pulmonary arteries, with the left pulmonary arch artery persisting as the arterial duct. And we'll come all the way back, bring this into focus when, in April, we discuss development of the outflow tract. But that completes my introduction to cardiac development, and hopefully that gives you the basis of understanding. So, Sasha, have we got everybody else on board now?
Let's see.
Norman.
Yes, good
Why
morning.
don't you kick off?
Well, we call it a collateral artery. I don't really want to get into a fight about it. I mean, it's I think it's not a problem for me to call it a collateral artery.
You're talking now about the alleged artery of the 5th arch, of course.
Correct.
And I mean, there is never 6 arches, so it's just nonsense.
Yes. Well, I mean, the issue is that firstly, Maud Abbott's statement about having to understand intelligent embryology makes it much easier to understand heart anatomy. And I think that this is a philosophy that is very important, because a lot of our education in embryology has been armchair education, and it's been cast in stone. And as you can see, as new facts and histological and three-dimensional models come about, we can understand that things have changed from our previous concepts. And so as it occurred in your case and most of ours, the concepts that were advanced originally were in error. And now we've been able to recognize from actual scientific data that these concepts have been wrong, and we've changed our concepts. And this shows, in fact, a mental alacrity on your part and ours as well, is that we can change our minds, and that science is such that the concepts that you have may change well when you have new data to support different concepts. And I think that's one of the important issues here. I think that a couple of things that came out to me today, very importantly, was that when you showed the Carnegie Stage 10 picture of Higgs boson, the original heart looks like, as it's enlarging, that the loop is left-sided. But the loop really only becomes right-sided later on when the ballooning takes place. And I think that is very important. So, I mean, I think that when you look at the data later on, it's ballooning that makes the heart buckle to the right side. The other concept that I thought was very interesting was the development of the mesocardial cells that come from the venous pole that segregate the right from the left side for the development of the pulmonary veins. That's not something that was fairly new to me today. And another concept that came to me in this talk, that it really doesn't matter whether you're looking at a human histology, mouse histology, or chick histology. They're all the same thing, and they can be interposed one with the other so that you can understand the development of the heart.
I mean, you're right there, that basically the mechanisms are all the same. There are subtle differences, more so with the chick than between mouse and human. But the point you make about mouse and man is absolutely correct, that there are very subtle differences, but by and large, what we see in man is recapitulated in the mouse. And it's much easier, of course, to work with the mouse embryos, because you can wash the blood out, you can blow them up, and as we move on and as we talk about atrial ventricular development and the outflow tract, I'll be using the mouse much more. And moreover, we can now manipulate the mouse, and we can knock out genes, and we can do all sorts of fancy things, and we can mark the cells in the mouse. But you're right, basically, the mechanisms are the same.
Sure. And my last comment relates to this in-series versus parallel development of the atria and the ventricles. And I think it explains very nicely the difference between isomeric atrial appendages and the fact that the ventricles are different and don't develop in the same way, but in a sequential way. And so that became very important for me to understand that. Although I've seen these things before many times, as most of the participants have done this morning, there are a number of radical and sequential differences, as you presented them to us, that make it much easier to understand. In the end, of course, it's still very, very dense in its material and requires us to look at the YouTube video, which is posted or will be posted again and again, so that we really understand this. And so I would just congratulate you, Bob, on a magnificent a series of constructions of all of these videos.
Well,
lastly,
Bob. Go on.
The last thing that I wanted to say for the participants that's important, because we always have to remember that there are people with greater and lesser skills than we have on our video that are listening. So we have to cover a spectrum of things. But the references to the Higgs boson original data and the ability to look at this of course, is very, very important and is a valuable lesson for any of the participants. I wasn't aware that you could get into the Newcastle data, but you've put that up there. Is it possible to just get into the data and look at that?
You just go into HDBR and it comes up, and there is material that is available free to everybody. If you're prepared to sign up to the developmental biology resource, you can in fact get much more access to it, but everybody has access to that data set. You can go in there and the sections are available to look at. The models of the hearts are available to look at. It is spectacular.
Let me ask you, are the Carnegie specimens, are they categorized as?
They are indeed, and they have examples in there with sections that go from Carnegie stage 10 to Carnegie stage 23.
Available to everybody.
Available to everybody.
Well, I think that's remarkable, because I mean, education doesn't end with looking at your lectures.
Indeed, indeed, and in fact, at the moment, the sections are not all labelled at the moment. But I'm still working on Deborah and with the people in Newcastle, and Deborah is having series that are being labelled. So every section will be labelled. So it's still a work in progress, but the material there already is amazing.
Yeah, and I think the last thing that was interesting in your lecture, which is not on some of the slides, is in fact that for example, the isomeric appendages, one was from a Japanese doctor whom I'd never heard of before, and the other was Nigel Brown's data. So, you know, you've put together stuff from very different sources that really characterize this and make it easy for us to understand very nicely. Thank you, Bob.
Well, thank you for suggesting this, Norman, and I'm glad I matched your expectations. Diane, Adrian has already had a chance to discuss with me what he is going to say, but Diane, what is your take on what I demonstrated this morning?
I think every time I see this stuff, I learn something new, and I'm very interested to hear about the staining that you showed relative to the pulmonary vein. I had not seen those particular slides in the past, and how the different components of the heart stain differently. And I'm interested in seeing a bit more about that in the next lecture.
Indeed, and I'll show more of that. And this is all Anton Moorman's stuff. Anton, in fact, has published quite extensively on that, along with the group in Amsterdam. So this is their material, and as it were, I've stolen that. But I will, as you say, I will move on from that when we talk about atrial development and show you still more material showing the difference between the pulmonary veins and the systemic veins. But that sort of whets your appetite. Go, Norman.
Do we have the dates for the next sessions in February, March?
It will be the last Friday in February, the last Friday in March, and the penultimate Friday in April, because in April we will all be gathering together on the last Friday for the Association of European Pediatric Cardiology meeting in Dublin. So the penultimate Friday in April, but the last Fridays, February and March. Adrian, you had also shown great interest in the mediastinal myocardium, but you have other questions as well.
Well, first of all, speaking of Japanese contributions, I'm joined by a consultant cardiac surgeon, Taka, who was very interested in the presentation and who would testify as well that probably the most resistant people to the new additions in embryology will be the surgeons. We are very conservative.
Well, as you know, Adrian, we're also trying to convince the surgeons that they need to take the evidence in hand, and I'm doing my best to persuade them. But Professor Waino, who shared that material with me, he's probably like myself close to retirement now, but he did exquisite work on the laterality genes. So there is a very strong heritage of embryologic work in Japan. So your colleagues should know about all the work that has come out of Japan to advance our knowledge in development.
Indeed, indeed. I think some of us are a bit, how to say, the fact that we learn embryology in a certain way, it's a hindrance for us, as you said 30, 40 years ago, because sometimes it's very difficult now to change the concepts. I think the new generation, if they start learning these concepts fresh, will have it easier than us. Because it's not only a problem of overlapping. We will discuss atrial, ventricular, but actually they overlap a lot during development, and it's difficult to make up in your mind. So I would propose that we create 3D prints of various embryological stages, and we can work on that, because I think they will be useful, especially with the fact that all the connective orifices, let's call them, the interventricular, the AV canal, and then the outlet, they come together and they are in different planes. It's very difficult to get them because we talk about a loop. I think there are several points of inflection there. And it's not that easy to understand them all at once because they overlap in development. So it's a hugely important session today. Thank you very much for this collaborative effort, because it sets the scene for what we are going to discuss in more detail.
Indeed, and that was the purpose, to set the scene, as it were. And you are right that the three-dimensionality is very important, and I think you are also correct that for the individual person, the 3D models would help, but that doesn't help when we have to present through the screen where we're still, in essence, dependent upon 2 dimensions. But I think it is feasible to do it. It's been suggested to me that we might also do animations. And certainly animations would be, certainly for the remodeling of the interventricular foramen, that will be the major part of what we will discuss in March. I think it would be very useful to see that. But I think the pictures, to me at any rate, the pictures of the 3-dimensional data sets are a great advance. And at least you have the essence of 3-dimensionality when you see the episcopic data sets, which brings something over and above the sections in themselves. But you are right. It is not easy to understand, but at least now we can see the real thing rather than looking at diagrams all the time.
I think it's a very good project for a student to create a VR, because virtual reality can help us understanding these 3D relationships better.
I mean, to an extent, a lot of that comes out of the interactive PD files, because if you go into, I know you were looking at the pictorial essay yourself, and you raised 1 or 2 of the problems that exist. You should not be put off by some of the writing, because if you go into the interactive PD files, the ability to manipulate the PD files, because you can move the models around, you can take them apart, you can put them back together again. And in many ways, that gives you the 3-dimensionality that you're asking. And that is possible in the files that have been prepared by Jill Hicksborough, and they are truly spectacular.
I don't like to disagree with Adrian, because essentially I do agree with him on all of his projects. But I think that if we look at the world in general, what the problem with the new students are going to be is that some of them are going to be taught with old concepts and others of them are going to be taught with new concepts, and there won't be any uniformity, and there'll be the same kind of diversion as we have currently existing in our cardiac nomenclature and understanding in embryology, because of the fact that not everybody that's teaching has got the same concepts in mind when they begin. And I think that that's much of a problem. As far as the 3-dimensionality is concerned, there are many cartoons available of cardiac development, but they all hold one thing that they don't develop, is that the size changes radically during development. And so the cartoon is usually portrayed as something that's occurring, you know, in a series of models and confined, and doesn't show the fact that growth is occurring in all of these things.
I mean,
And I
that's,
think
that's a crucial point you make, Norm, because a lot of the changes that we see represent differential growth, but it's so difficult. I mean, it's simply not possible to keep everything to scale. We have to blow them up and so match them. But you're right, we should also take note of the major changes that take place in terms of scale. It's it's an important point you make. We have had one question, if I may, which is particularly pertinent, from Jason Tan, who asks a very reasonable question about the pharyngeal arch arteries, because he says, how did the original 6 arches come about historically? And that's a very good question. And we are pondering that at the moment, because the person who did more than anything to convince me that there were only 5 arches is an embryologist who's working in London, who's called Anthony Graham. And Anthony Graham has published in the Journal of Anatomy in 2019, providing the evidence that there are only 5 arches. We're now working together, in fact, with Simon Bamforth from Newcastle, who worked with me on this topic, and along with Wout Lammers and Jill Hicksbos. And we have a work that we are about to submit where Anthony Graham has reviewed the evolution of these arches. And if you go back through the clades or the clades, however you do, and you look at fishes, you look at amphibians, you look at all the different phylums, some of them have 7 arches, some of them have 6 arches, but all amniotes, all mammals only have 5 arches. And so we're still not quite sure how it came about that people should have thought that in mammals there were 6 arches. And I think it's a throwback to the fact that in some of the less primitive, some of the more primitive animals, you can in fact find 6 or 7 arches. But it is a fact. And Anthony has confirmed that in an email we've had today. All amniotes, all mammals, all reptiles have only 5 arches. So where did the 6th one come from? Who knows? But it's a good question, Jason. I'm sorry I can't give you a good answer.
Bob, on that point about the disappearance of the arches, we know that if you look at some of the models, especially from Japan, that when you look at the arch development, that there are a number of fine arteries that still persist and remain. The arteries itself and the vascular supply doesn't disappear.
Correct.
For example, if you say the thyroid comes from the 3rd arch, for example, their thyroid arteries, of course, they come from different branches, you know, from the 4th and the 3rd arch, perhaps.
No, but you're right. You are right. And in fact, one of the proposals in the work that Anthony is focusing on at the moment is that we're going to give the arches names rather than numbers. So the 1st arch is the mandibular arch,
right.
2nd arch is the hyoid arch,
correct.
The 3rd arch is the carotid arch, the 4th arch is the systemic arch, and then the ultimate arch is the pulmonary arch. And you are correct that the 1st arch artery persists as the mandibular artery. The 2nd arch artery persists as the hyoid artery. Then you are right, the 3rd arch artery in part is the carotid, but also it has its branches, and one of those branches is the thyroid artery. So you are right.
Exactly. So, I mean, but the origin of the artery disappears, and they found anastomosis from different areas.
Correct. And also, that's the point I make about the collateral channels. So if you look at if in mouse embryos, for example, if you look at the termination of the 4th arch and the pulmonary arch at the dorsal aorta, in half of all mouse embryos, there are collateral channels. And it is those collateral channels that persist when you have double-barreled aorta.
Yes. Well, I think that looking at what you've said, that may make one of the future sessions a valuable session for
Indeed.
our presentations.
We
But,
will come back to that and we'll discuss that in greater detail. I'll go through the arch development again when we talk about the outflow tract.
And I think you can make the same points with the development of the venous system too. There are all these different things that are appearing and regressing, and that's how you can end up with multiple veno-venous bridges and interruptions and such.
Absolutely. And there,
Right.
particularly with the azygous system, you're absolutely right. That and the supra-subcardinal system and the venous system is even more complicated in many ways than the pharyngeal arches, but you're right.
yesterday at the Congenital Heart Academy, we talked about the Abernathy malformation, the portal system
Yep.
development, and the development of how the interaction between portal system development and venous system becomes important. So these are really things that teach us more about how embryology is very complex.
Indeed.
Prof, a quick question, Prof, on the ventral aortas. There is a short stage where there are two ventral aortas.
Correct. And they
Do
are before you get the arch arteries. So the ventral aortas are then replaced with the formation of the pouches and the arches, and then the arch arteries are replaced by initially the first arch artery, the mandibular arteries.
So it's not that one of them resorbs or
It's we're at the stage at which we call them the ventral aortas. There are no arches at that stage, so you can't really call the ventral aorta the first arch artery. But I fancy that the channel that is the first arch artery is the ventral aorta that is subsumed into the first pharyngeal arch as it is formed.
And the other important concept that you mentioned is the addition of new material. I think that also complicates things when you try to show them in 2D pictures, because it's not only the growth, it's also the addition of new material.
Yes. Anyway, Diane, do you have any more thoughts?
No, just on that point that Adrian just brought up, I think that staining is probably ultimate proof that the original heart tube stains one or doesn't stain in one way, and that the additions are now marked with the immunohistochemical stain. So that's an important point.
And when we get down, when we really dissect down into it, we look at the different genetic makeup of the different parts of the tube. I mean, if you go into the work that's being done, it is colossal how you can take apart these bits. Adrian was also asking me in separate exchanges, we had the difference between atrial and ventricular myocardium, and there are subtle differences in the makeup of the myosin chains, but that is something way above the simple anatomic changes that we're discussing. Anyway, thank you all very much for your comments. And so hopefully that is the introduction, and we will see you all again on the ultimate Friday of February. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.